Hey there! Tonight, you will be listening to John Louis Esposito talking about prophet and statesman, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from the Great World Religions series.
Last class we talked about the 5 pillars of Islam, and in particular focused on, in a sense, the foundation stones as are revealed in the Confession of Faith, God and the Prophet Muhammad. Today we'll spend some time looking at the Prophet Muhammad and his role in Islam. The origins of Islam and its prophet, like those of Judaism and Christianity, would have seemed improbable to many who were forecasting at the time. In many ways, just as some could have never thought that a slave Moses and a carpenter's son Jesus would play a major role in developing or generating 2 major world religious traditions, how much more improbable would it have seemed that an orphan, illiterate caravan manager, in many ways in the wilds of Arabia, in a country being torn by tribal strife, would in fact receive the revelation from God and become the great prophet of the second largest of the world's religion. A religion that has had a global religious, political, and cultural presence and impact throughout history. The birth of Muhammad and the fact that he was both a prophet receiving and reciting God's message, as well as a statesman responsible for guiding the development of a totally new community, its military protection, politics, and social development, have had a major impact on history. It's affected the history of religions, as well as international politics, for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, for more than 14 centuries. Information about Muhammad's life, his deeds and teaching, can be found in the Quran, early biographies, and the Hadith, or tradition literature. These are narrative reports of what the Prophet said and did. Muhammad is considered by Muslims to be God's human instrument, his messenger and prophet in receiving and reporting his revelation. The story of Muhammad's life and the emergence of the Muslim community have provided a paradigm to be remembered and emulated, and thus Muhammad's words and deeds represent the model, the ideal for all believers, what some have called the living Quran. As the Quran says, "You have in the messenger of God an excellent exemplar for him who looks to God in the last day and remembers God often." Quran chapter 32, verse 21. Muslims look to Muhammad's example for guidance in all aspects of life, including how to treat friends and enemies, marital and family relationships, personal hygiene, dress, diplomacy, warfare, carrying out religious duties, how to pray, when to pray. Muhammad was a multifaceted personality who served as a religious, political, and military leader of a community state. Mohammedan Muslim tradition can best be described, characterized as a remarkable personality who inspired confidence and commitment despite persecution and oppression, a shrewd military strategist, and a pious, righteous, trustworthy, compassionate, and honest man. He was also, and is also, portrayed as a caring husband and father who through his teachings and actions sought to improve the status of all women. Let's look at the context in which Muhammad and Islam emerged. The religious message that Muhammad preached grew out of and responded to the realities of 7th century Arabia. Like all religions, Islam did not appear in a vacuum, but was influenced and responded to the political and social conditions as well as other religious traditions. The world in which Islam emerged, 7th century Arabia, was a rough neighborhood, where war was the natural state of affairs. The broader Near East, in which Arabia was located, was divided itself between 2 warring superpowers of the day, the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire on the one hand, and the Sasanian Persian Empire on the other. Each had competed with each other for world dominion. 7th century Arabia was critically located along profitable trade routes of the Orient. As a result, it was subject to the rivalry and interventions of its powerful imperial neighbors. The rise and spread of Islam was caught though, in both local politics and fighting in Arabia, as well as the imperial warfare. Muhammad's preaching would add to this mix and would itself become a source of conflict as the Meccans resisted, as well as conflict resolution. Arabia and the city of Mecca, in which Muhammad lived and received God's revelation, was beset by tribal raids and cycles of vengeance and vendetta. Raiding was an integral part of tribal life and society. It was the way things ran. It had established regulations and customs. Raids were undertaken to increase property and goods, such as camels, cattle, jewelry, and slaves. Bloodshed was to be avoided if at all possible, lest it lead to retaliation and vendetta, the existing primitive form of justice. Pre-Islamic Arabia was tribal in its religious, social, and political ideas, its practices, its institutions, but it was also a multi-religious environment, home to a variety of religious traditions and practices, from the prevailing tribal polytheism to Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. Pre-Islamic Arabian religion was predominantly polytheistic, reflecting this tribal nature and social structure. Variety of gods and goddesses served as the protectors of tribes. Their spirits were associated with sacred objects, trees, rocks, springs, wells. These gods and goddesses were feared and respected rather than loved, the object of cultic rituals and supplication at local shrines. Tribal and family honor were central virtues. Manliness, courage in battle, chivalry, upholding tribal and family honor was a major virtue celebrated by all the poets of the time. Pre-Islamic Arabian religion had little sense of cosmic moral purpose or individual communal moral responsibility. There was no belief in the afterlife. Justice was obtained and carried out through vengeance and retaliation. Mecca, a rising commercial center, was the main site of a great annual pilgrimage to its central shrine, the Kaaba, the cube-shaped structure that housed at this time representations of some 360 different tribal gods and goddesses. Muhammad would later conclude, having received God's revelation, that the Kaaba was the original home built by Abraham and Ismail. But the identity had been lost as polytheism had overtaken the area and had, in effect, overtaken the Kaaba. At the head of the shrine's pantheon was a supreme god called Allah, creator and sustainer of life and of the universe, but remote from everyday concerns. This pilgrimage, sponsored by the Meccans, was a very profitable endeavor, bringing money, as worshippers of the many different gods from far and wide came to this center in Mecca, where money was exchanged, where trade took place. Judaism and Christianity existed within Arabia. Alongside pre-Islamic Arabian polytheism, there were then monotheistic communities present before the rise of Islam. Muhammad would encounter them also in his travels as a merchant and caravan manager. In addition to belief in a single all-powerful God, as we'll see, again, Islam shared with Christianity and Judaism many common beliefs, from prophets and revelation to notions of eternal reward and punishment. The message of Islam was revealed at and responded then to a time of great socio-economic transition in Arabia. Cities, more precisely oasis towns, most importantly Mecca and Medina, were attracting many nomads to a more sedentary lifestyle. Mecca was emerging as a major mercantile center at the heart of new political alliances, a new social and economic order. New wealth and the rise of new commercial classes led to a greater division between classes and a growing disparity between rich and poor. Amidst this environment, Muhammad was born, a member of the most prominent tribe, the Quraysh. His father and then his mother died, and so at a very early age, Muhammad was orphaned. He was raised by his uncle Abu Talib, a well-respected and powerful member of the Quraysh, who provided protection to Muhammad both in his early years as well as to Muhammad and the community later on. In a society that marginalized orphans, Muhammad would remain sensitive to their plight, as well as the plight of widows, like his mother, throughout his life. Prior to becoming a prophet, Muhammad earned a living as a business manager for caravans. He worked for a widow named Khadijah. She was 15 years older than Muhammad. They eventually married, and interestingly enough, tradition tells us that Khadijah was the one who approached him in an offer of marriage. There was a 15-year gap between their ages. Muhammad 25, Khadijah 40. Tradition records that they had 2 sons that died in infancy, and 4 daughters who survived. Khadijah was, in fact, the first person to believe in the revelation of Muhammad, and in many ways, the first Muslim convert. And as we'll see, she played a pivotal role in Muhammad's life. During their 24 years of marriage, Khadijah was Muhammad's only wife. As we'll discuss later, after Khadijah's death, Muhammad married a number of women. Most were widows, as was the custom of the time. Others were to forge alliances, political alliances. Muhammad was a man known for his integrity, his trustworthiness, his reflective nature, and would regularly retreat to a cave on a hilltop. In 610, on a night remembered in Muslim tradition as the night of power, or the night of power and excellence, Muhammad, born in 570 and who died in 632, at the age of 40, this businessman, this caravan manager, was called to be a prophet of God, and as we shall see, would later become the religio-political leader of a Muslim community state. So prophet and state. Muhammad heard a voice commanding him, recite. Muhammad replied warily that he had nothing to recite. Twice more, the angel repeated and commanded, recite. Muhammad, frightened and bewildered, pleaded that he didn't know what to say. Finally, the words came to him. Recite in the name of your Lord, who has created man out of a germ cell. Recite, for your Lord is the most generous one, who has taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know. This was the first of what would be many revelations from God, communicated by an intermediary, the angel Gabriel, over a 22-year period. Like the biblical prophets before him, Amos, Jeremiah, and others, Muhammad's initial reaction was consternation, surprise, fear, reluctance. Remember, prophets weren't exactly treated very well by those in their society, because they came and basically said to the society, there's something wrong here. They were calling them back to God from what was seen as their wandering from God's path. Muhammad also feared that he might be losing his mind, or that others would dismiss him as a madman. As in so many situations, he turned to his wife Khadijah, who reassured him that he wasn't crazy, that he indeed received God's revelation. They also turned to Khadijah's cousin, a Christian, Waraka. Waraka said to Muhammad, surely by him in whose hand is Waraka's soul, you are the prophet of the people. The angel Gabriel, who came to Moses, has come to you. But Waraka warned Muhammad, like the Hebrew prophets, you will be called a liar, and they will treat you contemptuously, cast you out and fight you. Muhammad continued to receive his revelations then for the rest of his life, for 22 years until he died in 632. They were preserved verbatim orally and then written down by scribes, and would later be collected and compiled into the Quran. Muhammad's reformist message posed, though, an unwelcome challenge to the religious and political establishment, the priests, the tribal leaders, the businessmen of the community. For indeed, like all prophets, he was a warner. The new religious message that Muhammad preached, like that of Amos and other biblical prophets, denounced the status quo, called for social justice for the poor, for the oppressed, the most vulnerable in society, for women, children, orphans. Muhammad in the Quran condemned Arabian polytheism and put a spotlight on Meccan society's unbridled materialism, its avarice, its corruption, characterized as the condition of pre-Islamic Arabia's pagan, Jahiliyyah society. That is, a society that was ignorant of Islam. The term Jahiliyyah originally referred to pre-Islamic Arabia. However, it becomes a very important term today, rich in meaning, reappropriated and reinterpreted by fundamentalists and by others within the Muslim community to describe the condition of modern society. And so, extremists will use the term Jahiliyyah to describe modern societies, their own as well as Western societies, as un-Islamic or anti-Islamic. Muhammad was also a reformer, as all the great biblical prophets were. He brought a prophetic message that summoned people to strive, to struggle, jihad, to reform their communities, to live a good life based on religious belief and not loyalty to the tribe. This insistence that each person was personally accountable, not to primary tribal customary law, but to an overriding divine law, shook the very foundations of Arabian society and custom. Muhammad's newly claimed status and authority as God's messenger, and his entreaties to believers to take action against social corruption in society, was in fact a direct threat to the powerful elites of Mecca. Muhammad proclaimed a sweeping program of religious and social reform that affected religious life and practice, business contracts, gender relations, family relations. Most importantly, the Quran rejected Arabian polytheism and insisted that there was only one true God. The oneness or unity of God, the absolute monotheism of Islam, would become the foundation stone of Muslim faith and belief. The Quran denounced corrupt practices, the practices of many merchants, and the exploitation of orphans and their inheritance rights. It condemned infanticide, spoke of the religious equality of men and women, expanded the marriage and inheritance rights of women. To uphold this deeply challenging message and mission, Muhammad and his followers would not only have to preach their message in an increasing hostile environment, but also fight, to wage a sacred struggle, to wage a jihad to stay alive. Muhammad's claim to be God's prophet and the divine revelation he proclaimed undermined traditional tribal political authority and sources of revenue, namely the revenues accrued during the annual pilgrimage, the festival to this polytheistic shrine. The first 10 years of Muhammad's preaching in Mecca, as a result, were marked by resistance, produced very limited results. The community was small and under constant pressure, suffering derision, verbal attacks, and later active persecution. The life and livelihood of the community was eventually threatened by sanctions that prevented them from doing business and were literally starving them out. The hardship may well have contributed to the death of Khadijah. It certainly contributed to the bankruptcy of Muhammad's protector, Abu Talib. Muhammad was now, and most likely, a target for assassination, with no longer the protection of his uncle. It was at this very low point in Muhammad's life that an incredible mystical experience occurred, the night journey, or ascension. One night, while sleeping near the Kaaba, Muhammad was awakened by the angel Gabriel. Muhammad mounted a mystical steed who flew him from Mecca to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, referred to in the Quran as Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, the further mosque, and its site, the Temple Mount. Here Muhammad climbed a ladder leading to the throne of God. Along the way he met the great patriarchs and prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, John the Baptist, Joseph, as well as other prophets. During his meeting with God, Muhammad received guidance. Among the guidance received was the fixing of the prayers, the daily prayers, at 5. The night journey made Jerusalem, for Muslims, the third holiest city after Mecca and Medina in Islam, and affirmed a continuity and affinity of Islam with Judaism and Christianity. That Jerusalem connection. A continuity that has theological significance, but also, regrettably, has also influenced conflict down through the ages. Faced with ever-increasing threats and persecution, in 622 Muhammad accepted an invitation from the warring clans of the city of Yathrib, which the city later renamed Medina. This was a city where peoples were locked in a cycle of vendetta and destruction. To find some way out, they looked for an arbiter, and Muhammad had that reputation I referred to before as being an honest man and a good arbiter. And he was invited to the settlement to be a binding arbitrator amidst these diverse groups. It was a testimony to his established reputation. Muhammad began sending his followers to Yathrib, which is approximately 250 miles north of Mecca. He followed a short time later himself, escaping a plot to kill him, and made his way with Abu Bakr, his companion, and the man who would later become his first successor, or caliph. Yathrib itself would later be named Medina, Medinatun Nabi, the city of the Prophet. The year 622, when this migration or hijra took place, this migration to Medina, is centrally significant. It underscores the importance of the notion of community in Islam. The Muslim calendar begins with the year of the hijra, the creation of the Islamic community, rather than, let's say, with the year the Prophet was born, the year the Prophet died, or the year that he first received the revelation. It is also this year that marks the transformation of Islam from being purely a religion of individuals to a religion that would inform state and society. In Medina, the fortunes of the Muslim community improved and thrived, resulting in the establishment of the first community state. The experience and example of Muhammad's nascent community would provide the model for later generations, both then and now. In times of danger, the twin ideals of hijra and jihad, emigrate from a hostile anti-Islamic environment, or jihad, resist and fight against oppression and injustice, were established. Again, twin ideals that have endured throughout history. These concepts became guiding principles for responding to persecution and rejection, to threats to the faith, to the security and survival of the community. In the midst of persecution or resistance to aggression, Quranic verses revealed shortly after the hijrah to Medina provided guidance concerning armed struggle and jihad. As the Quran says, leave is given to those who fight because they were wrong. Surely God is able to help them, who were expelled from their homes wrongfully, for saying, our Lord is God. Quran chapter 22, verse 39. The defensive nature of this struggle or jihad is reinforced in the second chapter of the Quran, verse 190, which commands fighting against aggression and against aggressors, but warns against aggression itself. And fight in the way of God with those who fight you, but aggress not. God loves not the aggressors. Both mainstream and extremist movements and self-proclaimed holy warriors like Osama bin Laden have used the pattern of hijra and jihad for their own purposes. We'll discuss this in later lessons. In Medina, Muhammad, therefore, was both prophet and head of state, leader of a multi-religious community comprised of Muslims and non-Muslims. The constitution or charter of Medina, established by Muhammad, sets out the rights and duties of all citizens and the relationship of the Muslim community to other communities. It reflects this religious diversity. It recognized people of the book. And so Jews and Christians who had received God's revelation through their prophets were seen as allied and allies of the community. These people of the book were entitled to live in coexistence with Muslims, retain and practice their religion in return for loyalty and payment of a head tax or a poll tax. Having established this community at Medina, the bitter conflict between Mecca and Muhammad and his followers continued. For Muhammad threatened the economic power and political authority of the Meccan leaders. And he did that with a series of raids against Meccan caravans. In addition to several key battles occurred in this ongoing conflict between the powerful Meccans and the Muslims. These are remembered by Muslim tradition as a source of inspiration and guidance. Let's take a brief look at some of them. First and foremost, Badr. The Battle of Badr took place in 624. Muslim forces, although greatly outnumbered, defeated the Meccan army in the Battle of Badr, when they were aided, as the Quran in chapter 3, verse 20 says, aided by thousands of angels who assisted them. This battle has special significance for Muslims because it represents the victory of monotheism over polytheism, good over evil, the army of God over the army of ignorance and unbelief. Badr remains an important symbol for contemporary Muslims. For example, Egypt, when it launched the 1973 Arab-Israeli War under Anwar Sadat, declared a jihad, and its code name was Operation Badr. A second and important battle was the Battle of Uhud. The Battle of Uhud fought in 625, but this was a major setback for the Muslims. They were overwhelmed by the Meccans, soundly defeated, and Muhammad himself was wounded. In 627, the Meccans decided to finish the job and mounted a battle that came to be remembered as the Battle of the Ditch. They brought the Muslims, or put the Muslims, under siege. However, the Battle of the Ditch, or the Battle of the Trench, proved a major turning point. Muslims dug a trench to protect themselves from the Meccan cavalry. From within their enclave, the Muslims doggedly resisted the Meccan siege, and in the end, the Meccans were forced to withdraw. The Meccan loss led to the ascendancy of Muhammad to a position of influence, of recognized influence and independence. It began the shift of the balance of power in favor of the Muslims. Here we have to deal with a very important and contentious point: Muslim-Jewish relations during that battle and shortly after, which particularly deteriorated as a result of the Battle of the Ditch. Muhammad, as you'll recall, anticipated the acceptance and eventual conversion of Jewish tribes. Thus he had had the early community pray facing Jerusalem. However, the Jews did not recognize his prophethood. And politically powerful tribes, some, like the Banu Qurayza, kept up their relations with the Quraysh, Muhammad's and the Muslims' enemy. During the Battle of the Ditch, the Quraysh encouraged the Banu Qurayza to attack Muhammad from the rear. Muhammad accused them of treason, conspiring with the enemy, and breaking their agreement under the Constitution or Charter of Medina. He moved decisively to crush them. After a 25-day siege, they surrendered, their men were executed, the women and children taken captive. Although there are many passages in the Quran that speak of Jews as people of the book, recognizing God's revelation to Moses, Muhammad's treatment of these Jewish tribes in Medina has been cited by those who charge he was anti-Semitic, as well as by Muslim extremists like Osama bin Laden, to support their anti-Semitism. However, it's important to note that the tensions and ultimate violence between Muslims and Jews at that time were more political than theological or racial. Muhammad regarded them as traitors, guilty of treason, a political threat to Medina, an obstacle to the consolidation of Muslim dominance and rule in Arabia. He responded as was the custom in Arabia and in many societies in his day. Remember, this was a rough area, rough time. Indeed, Muhammad's use of warfare was comparable to the warfare that we see at times in the Old Testament under Joshua, David, Saul, in which God sanctioned battle with God's enemies. The Muslims of Medina continued to coexist with other smaller Jewish tribes, living side by side with those who honored the covenant. They would continue to do so in later centuries in Islamic empires from Andalusia to North Africa and to the Ottoman Empire. It's important to recall that when Jews were driven out of Andalusia, out of Spain, they fled to North Africa and to the Ottoman Empire, where they were welcomed and able to continue to live and survive. Finally, in 628, a truce was struck between the Meccans and the Muslims in Hudaybiyah, allowing Muslims the right to make the pilgrimage the following year, but requiring that Muhammad end his raids with their attempt at an economic blockade of Mecca. At the same time, the truce signaled the political legitimacy of Muhammad. In 630, the feud between Mecca and Medina came to an end. After client tribes of Mecca and Medina clashed, Muhammad declared the truce broken and moved against Mecca with a large force. The Quraysh capitulated, the Meccans converted to Islam, and a Pax Islamica or Islamic order was created. In victory, Muhammad proved magnanimous and strategic, using diplomacy rather than force. Avoiding vengeance and plunder, he offered amnesty to his enemies. Regarding the Kaaba as the original house of the true religion, of true monotheism, he cleansed it of its idols, of its 360 idols. The Meccans, many of his oldest enemies, now joined, converting to Islam, some becoming leaders in the community. The conquest of Mecca established Muhammad's paramount political leadership. He continued to employ his religious message diplomatic skills, and when necessary force to establish Muslim rule in Arabia. Consolidation of Arabia took place in the final 2 years before his death, and so when he died in 632, all of Arabia was united under the banner of Islam. Within a matter of decades, Muhammad had initiated a major religious and historical transformation that began in Arabia but would become a global religious and political movement. He created a community based upon a common religious bond, way of life, monotheistic vision, and brought a religious synthesis that recognized and incorporated Jewish and Christian prophets and revelations and a universal mission to spread God's word and rule. It is this life, an example of the prophet, that will continue to inspire the life and development of the community, as we'll see in our remaining lessons.